Okay, let's talk about annotating your research novel. So, annotating basically just means making notes. And there's a structured way that we're recommending you make these notes so that, for one thing, when I check your novel, I can recognize what your notes mean. There's kind of a uniform way of doing it so that I can understand everyone's notes. But when you realize that really annotating is not that scary, it just means that you are writing down your thoughts, making notes about your thoughts as you read. So it's basically just documenting what you're questioning, what you're thinking, what meanings you're finding in the novel as you're reading it. Okay. So we're going to look at the annotation guide. We're going to go over a few things that we went over in class, but this way you have them to look back over and review and refresh your memory about. And the assignments, the home assignments for this week are strictly just to read and annotate your book. So that's why I'm including this little explanation for you to kind of remind you what to do and help you out with it. So this is the annotation guide that I put on Google Classroom and we went over in class. And it talks in this paragraph, which I'm not going to read, but it talks about what annotations actually are. And it's basically just kind of showing your work, showing your thoughts, making notes about your thoughts as you're doing the reading. You do need to have a few tools. You need to have some highlighters and maybe even different color highlighters, because your different color highlights could mean different things, and you can set up that system. You need to have some index cards. They don't have to be colored. And you need to have pen or pencil, obviously. And then whatever else you feel like you need. If you want to include some sticky notes, if you want to use sticky notes, if you want to have other types of tabs or bookmarks or, anything else that you feel like you need that's going to help you. So there are some things that I want you to record in certain places in the book, just so when I'm looking at it, I know where to look for these things. Inside the front cover, I just want you to record, and you can just put the page numbers of important passages that you find. So if you feel like, obviously there are not going to be 100 of these throughout the novel, but if you feel like this is just really the climax of the story, this is the turning point for the main character in the entire story, then definitely write that down. Put what page it occurred and just put turning point or something like that. You don't have to write a big long sentence or paragraph about it. Just put one word that lets you know what was happening in that passage. The other thing I want you to do is create an index card. They don't have to be colored, but create an index card for each main character, so that as you're going through the characters, because that's one of the things you're going to write about in your analysis essay, you can look back, you can have those notes, you can have them in a specific place, you can even move them around the novel if you have them on index cards. So it says take notes for that character, put them inside the book, move them around the book where you need to be reminded about certain things about the character as you read. Use the back cover of the book for vocab words, and we talked about this in class. Vocab words, when you're reading a novel like this, are not going to be assigned to you because obviously everyone's reading a different book. The vocab words that you're looking for are words that you do not necessarily know the meaning of, and you may have to look them up to understand what it's saying, or you may be able to figure it out in the context of what you're reading, but you don't initially know the definition. So you're recording those words because they're new words that you're learning, and they're words that you had to look up or make a note about in order to understand them. Then we talked about at the beginning of each chapter writing a little summary. And you might wonder why you're writing this at the beginning of the chapter, because you're going to read it, then you're going to have to go back and write it instead of writing it at the end of the chapter. And the reason for that is because as you go back through the novel later, especially when you're writing the analysis paper, having these summaries at the beginning of each chapter is just going to very quickly remind you what's happening in that chapter and help you locate certain events and certain things that you're looking for in the book. So once you read the chapter, go back and write a little summary. This can be very short. It can just be a few sentences, but you're basically putting things that are important from that chapter that if you're going back through and trying to look for, you can easily find and locate where things are happening in the novel. And then we're talking about within the novel itself, within the margins of the chapter. So use the top margins to just write a few phrases, a few keywords about what's happening. And this is not necessarily going to be on every single page because you're not going to have something terribly significant on every page. So I'm not looking for every single page of the novel to have writing on it. But there should definitely be some notes or keywords in the top margin for significant things throughout the chapter. Same thing with the bottom and the side margins. This is where you're really making notes about things that you're highlighting. One thing that I definitely do not ever want to see is something underlined or something highlighted in your book where you did not make a note in the margin explaining what that was, explaining what it meant. Even if your note is just a word, or even if it's a question mark, it says here use question marks for sections you don't understand. You could highlight something and then put question marks beside it. You could use exclamation points for things that you felt are really important. But you have to have some kind of note for everything that you highlight or everything that you underline, because if you're just going through and indiscriminately highlighting things, you may not remember later why you highlighted it, what was significant or important about that. And I'm certainly not going to know what you thought was significant or important enough to highlight or underline. So always make some sort of note in the margin about that. This says circle words you don't know, add that to your vocab list. You can bracket important ideas or passages. And then other literary devices to consider. There's a list here, and these are things that you're not going to see in every single chapter on every single page, but you are going to see some of them periodically throughout the novel. So I want you to mark them when you do see them. And those are things like symbols. Okay, for symbols, you can just put an S. Theme, you can put a TH. Theme is one of the other things that we are going to write about in the analysis paper. So it's important as you're reading through the novel that you look for things that you believe to be the main idea or the main lesson in the story. And you're marking those with a TH for theme. Another one is imagery. You can just put an I out to the side for something that you feel is described in such a way that it really appeals to your imagination and you really get that image in your head. Figurative language would include comparisons that are made, like similes or metaphors. So you can mark those with an F. And then tone is another one. Remember, the tone is the overall mood. Now, the mood can shift throughout a novel, especially because it's a longer work. You could have a sad tone in part of it, and then a happy or cheerful tone in another part of the novel. So when you mark tone, you may have to mark, make a note about what the tone is or how the tone is changing or shifting, okay? So you can mark a T, but then you may have to give more information. So all of these things are important to identify as you come across them, but you're not going to come across them on every single page or maybe even in every single chapter. So just be aware of that. It's important that you understand that your annotations are there to help you, okay? You're not writing them for me. Now, I'm going to look at your annotations. I am going to be looking for certain things, but ultimately, you're not writing them for me. You're not writing them to complete an assignment that I'm going to check. You're writing them for you. Because when you're writing the paper later, you want to be able to look back through your book and see what your thoughts were as you were reading the book. That's how you're going to get your information to write the paper. So even your notes that you're making, it's not as important that I understand what your note means. It's important that you understand what your note means when you go back and look at it later. So make sure that when you're writing these, when you're making these notes, when you're marking these things, when you're highlighting or underlining, whatever it is you're doing, even writing your summaries, that you're writing them for you to understand. Okay? That's the whole point of doing this. Because you're gonna go back later and try to use this information to write your paper. So, like I said, it's much more important that you understand your notes, than it is that I understand your notes. I just want to see that you're making the notes. So think of your annotations as just your thoughts on paper. You're recording what you're thinking about as you read. You're recording the meanings that you're getting from the story. And these are going to be things that are going to help you later on. So don't look at it so much as a chore, although I know that probably is what it feels like right now. Look at it as you're making notes along the way to help you later. And if you kind of see it in that sense, it's going to make it much easier for you to do. Please make sure that you ask me any questions, whether it's sending me an email or asking me in class about things that have to do with annotations. It is a very important part of this whole process, and it's going to help you later to be able to write the paper that you have to write for your novel.